Hey, all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So, this week's been kind of a weird week because Tuesday was the SAT and it was still a remote day, and Wednesday there was no Google Meet. So, we've been kind of having a lot of meetings this week, and I had to give the SAT. So, I'm going to be putting out a new attendance for this week sometime today. So, in case you've been wondering where that's at, that's what's going on with that. And then, if you need any help this week, still make sure you email me, or we could do a one-on-one Google Meet if you need help. Monday, I'm hoping you worked on your Japanese internment camp assignment. If you're looking for notes for additional references and that information, it's the end of the Zoot Suit Riot notes. It's not in the actual lecture, but it's in the notes under classwork. We didn't really do notes as a class on that section, but if you're looking for information, it is under classwork in those American World War II, Chapter 14, Section 3 Homefront notes. It was more so that we just talked about the different reasons that the U.S. decided to put Japanese Americans into internment camps because of the fact that, they felt they were spies, they were living in critical areas as farmers, as fishermen near naval bases, they could report their activities back to the Japanese. There were Japanese people who were considered dangerous, spies, so many living in an area. For the most part, the government did not feel they were a threat, though, at least in the Munson Report. It really came down to racism, the fact that the Japanese looked different compared to German Americans and Italian Americans. And when Korematsu tried to, defy Executive Order 9066, which said they were not going to the camps, it was going to be a loss of his personal freedoms, it was going to, be a detriment to his rights as an American citizen, it was going to, destroy his business and his way of life. The U.S. government basically in the Supreme Court said, no, you still have to go, you defied the order, you're still in trouble here. And you don't really have any rights in a time of war. You're expected to make a personal sacrifice. The military is doing its best to guide the public's interests. But later in 1983, they realized that Korematsu had been wrongfully imprisoned, that the Supreme Court was really wrong. They gave their apologies to Korematsu. They decided to pay reparations or money to Korematsu and many Japanese Americans. Later, he was given the Congressional Medal of Freedom by President Clinton in 1996. And this last report in Document E really talked about how it was more so wartime hysteria and panic that really kind of led to these rash actions that the U.S. government really regretted. So today in class, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be finishing up the bookwork for this chapter. So we're going to be doing a bookwork assignment and then submitting the bookwork. So if you already tried to submit it, I returned it back to you because, we do kind of one every couple of days in class. I think there was only one we did on a remote day, and it really just depends on how far we get. Sometimes, I think we're going to do a bookwork assignment and we don't get to it because that's how real school is. It just depends on how the discussion goes in the classroom. So we're going to be finishing that up. So the last one's up now. I think there's 5 different pages total. So you can get that turned in by Friday at midnight. And then the last assignment for this week is the battles worksheet. So make sure that you're working on that. That you're getting information filled in on that battles worksheet. So talking about, today, we're really going to be moving forward in World War II in terms of battles. And we're really going to start off by talking about the Pacific Front today. So you have to remember that World War II is so much more complicated than World War I because you're looking at a war that's being fought in the Pacific, in Africa, but also that's being fought in Europe. And at the Atlantic Charter, that meeting that was held between FDR and Churchill way back in 1940, before the U.S. got involved in World War II, the U.S. had agreed that, yes, they would like to go after Hitler, but it's probably physically impossible because he's already taken over the European continent. So in the meantime, they're going to be looking at taking over destroying U-boats and fighting this Battle of the Atlantic. They're going to be looking to try to take over territory closer to really launch their invasion in Europe. They're going to be interested in fighting in North Africa if they can at all there. And they're also going to be interested, of course, in kind of fighting in Japan. And not really in Japan right away, though. Yet again, they're going to have to get there, just like with Germany, but fighting really in the Pacific to make their way closer to Japan, since Japan has really kind of taken over the territory that's closest to them. So it's going to be really difficult. Now, thinking about Japan's goals, Japan so far has, really kind of played their part well. Remember, first they had taken over, and I think I've got a map to show you. There you go. There's a map. But Japan had first taken over years ago. Remember, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they took over Korea. Then in 1931, they took over Manchuria. Then in 1937, they attacked China. And then as the US basically placed sanctions on them and froze their financial assets, they responded instead of being scared, but going to French Indochina and taking over more territory. And that's when the embargo was placed on them officially, and we started really kind of limiting their access to oil. And since they were going to need oil to, really create their empire, and the US was standing in their way in the Philippines, that's when they decided to attack at Pearl Harbor. And you can see kind of, I thought I had a map here of Hawaii. Here's a good map where you can kind of see, so in relation to where Pearl Harbor is at, compared to where everything is at in Asia, just so you can kind of see, they figure they're going to take out Pearl Harbor, take out, Hawaii and destroy the U.S. before the U.S. Pacific Fleet can come on in and, really stop them from taking over all the Pacific. At least that was their hope. Take out our aircraft carriers, take out our battleships. Things, of course, did not go as planned. And then they could continue to take over all of Asia, creating their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, getting oil, getting resources, making the Axis powers proud. And as they take over all these islands, it becomes very difficult to attack, the Japanese islands because you've already secured, all of this territory. Just want to go back. I just want to show you a couple maps there. So that's basically been, Japan's plan during this whole time is just to, take over the world. They believe that they are this superior race, that they are this new world order. They, of course, need oil and resources to do so. They were angry with the U.S.'s actions by cutting off our oil, cutting off oil to them, placing an embargo on them, freezing their financial assets. They felt like war was inevitable. Of course, they attacked Pearl Harbor because of these reasons. And, we got really lucky, or perhaps FDR knew about it, but a couple of our aircraft carriers were not there at the time. And so we were able to launch a retaliatory attack relatively soon. We start planning it as soon as, Pearl Harbor's been attacked, and we've officially declared war on December 8th. But the actual retaliation attack, which is called Doolittle's Raid, will not happen until April. It's going to be more so about planning the attack till then. The country's going to have to mobilize. We have to train troops. We have to create a draft. There's going to be propaganda. We need supplies. We're going to be rebuilding ships. It's going to be difficult for us to, of course, attack back for those reasons we kind of just mentioned. And so looking back at this other map that I showed you, this is what I was talking about. This is Japan's real empire by 1942. And you can see that it does get pretty sketchy. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, they're going to be going ahead and they attack the Dutch East Indies there. And then they go ahead, they attack the Philippines. They also go in and attack New Guinea. And you can see around Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal. And the thought was that next they were going to be going on to Australia. And they go further up north. They take some of these smaller islands here like Formosa, the Marshall Islands, Marina Islands, Himojima, Wake Islands, Gilbert Islands, you name it. So they really do have this massive empire, where they're interested in getting the U.S. base in Midway. And they're really kind of extending further and further out towards Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, and perhaps even over to, the United States. So they're really controlling the Pacific for the most part here. They have created this Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere where they have claimed the territory as their own. They say they have the exclusive trade rights, and they're making a name for themselves. They're definitely dominating in 1942, seeming kind of unstoppable, just the way Hitler had been really in 1939 and 1940. So they're definitely on the offense here, and they're kind of a group to be feared. But of course, the United States, of course, does own and control the Philippines. So how do we respond to this attack? Well, we respond, to the best of our abilities, but we're going to be outnumbered and ill-prepared basically at this point, because the attack is going to be coming right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So now when it comes to the taking of the Philippines, the man that you see in the picture is General Douglas MacArthur. And Douglas MacArthur is one of the most famous commanders in all of American history. We actually talked about him before in our Great Depression and New Deal unit. He was the man who President Hoover had sent in at the time to go clear out the bonus army, the people who were, kind of protesting outside the White House while Hoover was in office right after the Depression had hit. I shouldn't say right after, it was really like 1931 to 1932, while Hoover was running for re-election. And these men were World War I veterans who wanted their pension money, their retirement money early, saying they would not live to get that money. They were going to starve to death by then. And MacArthur was supposed to go in and clear out the camps, clear out the protesters, but he burned them down. A couple of people died. It turned into a disaster. And Hoover took the blame rather than MacArthur. In reality, he probably should have blamed MacArthur, tried to save his political career, because MacArthur really was a menace. And he's not quite a menace in World War II. In World War II, most of his actions are justified and make sense, and he becomes more of a war hero, but he's really a menace more so in Korea, which will be our next war. We'll cover very, very briefly the Korean War. But he really kind of doesn't always agree with the president, and they're often at odds. And he thinks that he's more powerful, can make decisions, but that's not really the way the military works. You have to still listen to your commander-in-chief, the president, since they are head of the military. So what happens is that the Japanese attack the island of the Philippines, and they attack this in just a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the Philippines haven't even really received word about the attack. They're just kind of getting information on it. They're not truly prepared. Of course, they can't get any reinforcements in. And then here comes the attack by air, by sea. We see, an invasion of soldiers coming in. People are getting, killed. Civilians are getting attacked. Most of the troops try to basically move back and try to create a stronghold for themselves at the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, hoping that, American reinforcements will come. They have no idea how bad the attack on Pearl Harbor was. They don't realize that many of our battleships have been destroyed, that the aircraft carriers can't get there in time, that we don't, have the planes ready, we don't have the manpower. It's just kind of a bit of chaos. And so, really the U.S. is kind of between a rock and a hard place. Some people criticize the U.S. response, saying that FDR should have been more prepared for this, been more ready, kind of helped our American troops that were stationed there, get troops, supplies, things there sooner. He said there were supply issues, training issues. We just really weren't ready. So what we're going to see happen is that these men who are surrounded on the Bataan Peninsula are literally starving. And we know that they're starving, infection is setting in, they're dying from disease, they're in crowded close quarters, they're constantly fighting, they're physically exhausted. And the president is able to get a message to MacArthur saying, you need to leave. You're a U.S. general. They're going to torture you. They're going to try to get information out of you, their codes, information as far as how we run our military strategies, what we could possibly do. If we were trying to counterattack to retake the island, you need to flee. And so he goes to Australia, which is owned by Great Britain, which is our ally. And of course, Australia is going to be one of the upcoming targets for the Japanese, but he's going to go there and flee and try to protect himself. But unfortunately, he's only able to flee in basically a small boat. He's not able to take his men with him. They're going to keep fighting so that it's possible for him to basically flee. And he says, I shall return. He feels terrible about this, but he's under president orders. This is one of the times he actually does listen to the president and takes the orders seriously. And these men can only hold out for so long, since the fighting now is going on for 3 months. And eventually, by April of 42, the Americans and the Filipinos, who were actually at this point fighting with them against the Japanese, looking at the Americans for once as kind of their allies, they eventually surrender. And now what happens is one of the most devastating things in American history. It's one of the book assignments that you're going to be looking at. We see it's called the Bataan Death March, where about 75,000 Filipino and American troops are forced to march from this Bataan Peninsula to these prison camps that have been created on the other side of the island by the Japanese government. And they're given very little food, very little water. We know they were tortured on this march. They were shown water, they were shown food, but they were not allowed to have it. They were physically, emotionally abused, and about 10,000 people died during the march from disease, from hunger, from exhaustion, and many thousand more died in these POW, these prisoner of war camps at this terrible Camp O'Donnell, which just had disastrous conditions. And so eventually we will liberate these Americans, these Filipino troops. We will retake the Philippines, but it's not going to be for a couple of years yet, as the U.S., honestly, is having a rough time And so the US, is trying to formulate its battle strategy for the Pacific, and we're not going to have a lot of help in the Pacific. When it comes to our allies, Stalin says, look, we got our hands full here in Russia, and Churchill says, we have so many of our troops and our supplies that were lost helping the French and the Polish and, fighting ourselves here against Hitler. We have our hands full in Europe. We can't really help you in the Pacific, so we're really kind of on our own here. So we've decided that we're going to eventually use this island hopping campaign where we capture strategic islands so that we eventually can come within range of attacking Japan itself. And we know that's going to be difficult because you basically have to retake the territory that Japan has already taken. So you can get closer to, bomb Japan and to eventually launch, a true invasion of Japan. Otherwise, your bombers are not long range and they're going to run out of fuel. And this really kind of makes, the president and the American people unhappy. They want revenge for Pearl Harbor. They want to attack the Japanese mainland themselves. They want to, destroy it. And that's not something that's physically in our capabilities at this point. It's going to be our long-range plan is to retake the Philippines, attack Japan itself. And so this campaign is going to be led by Douglas MacArthur, of the Army, of Chester Nimitz, of the Navy. We would like to cut the Japanese off from any supplies, from any allies that they may have, from the Axis powers, or from any island nations that actually might welcome them, which seems highly unlikely. And so what we do come up with is basically a way that we can attack some, the Japanese people themselves, try to get some revenge for Pearl Harbor, perhaps strike some fear into the Japanese, a moderate amount at most. And so we come up with a Doolittle raid. And so in class, we're not actually going to do notes on this slide. We're just going to be going over the battles worksheet, but I'll give you guys kind of the insight here in notes. So when it comes to the Doolittle raids, what we see here is that Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, he is going to be put in commission of this special plan where they say we're going to launch aircraft carriers, the ones that didn't get blown up at Pearl Harbor, and we're going to launch B-25 bombers from these aircraft carriers, which means they're long-range bombers. They can actually make it. We want to stay close to Pearl Harbor. We want to stay, close to our own territory where we feel safe and protected for now. We want to fly these planes in as far as they can go. They'll have enough gas to get to Japan itself, to launch an attack, to show the Japanese that we're not scared, that we're willing to fight back, that we can actually get to them, that they're not like untouchable. We can destroy Tokyo. We're going to be going after military targets, but it's possible that civilians may, see damage, or get injured as well, which was basically the same thing that they did to us at Pearl Harbor. So we're not like going after, citizens the way that Hitler does. We're just giving them back what they did to us. But those planes would not have enough gas, and they would be unable to land back on this aircraft carrier because they're long-range bombers, and you have basically this short landing area, and they can't do it. They need a longer place where they can stop. And so they're going to have to land in China, and it's going to be difficult for them to land in China because Japan, remember, has attacked and has retaken China. So even though China was our ally at this point, Japan has been attacking it since 1937, and much of it is Japanese territory. So it's pretty much a suicide mission for Americans in a way, because you go on this bombing raid and you have no idea, what's going to happen. We are able to attack Tokyo. We are able to destroy some territory. We destroy some of their planes. We, do cause some casualties, mostly of their military, not really of civilian nature. And as far as our airmen, we know that many of the planes do land back. Some of the planes are blown up. Some of the other planes do land in China. And unfortunately, 3 of the planes that land in China land in Japanese territory. And so those men are captured. You can see the man in the picture there at the top. He was blindfolded, he was captured, and he was executed. They were not allowed, to be freed. They thought this was a time of war. They wanted to make an example out of these men. And so, yeah, it was not a happy ending for the men in Doolittle's raid. It's kind of a sad story. But it is part of the whole idea that the Americans will fight back. And if you notice the date, this doesn't happen, as I said, until April of 42, months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, as far as the battles in the Pacific, we're also going to be covering in class today the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. Now, the Battle of Coral Sea is really important. It's right by the island of New Guinea. So if I go ahead on this map, you can see Coral Sea. It's right by the island of New Guinea, and it's really going to be fought in the air. So basically at this point, the Japanese have gone ahead and they have taken this area, at least part of New Guinea. I think I showed you it before on this earlier map. So you can see they've taken part of New Guinea there at the top, but not all of it. And they would like to take the rest of New Guinea and then launch a whole full-scale invasion of Australia, which I know sounds crazy, but that's what they would eventually like to do, believing that they are somehow superior. And they would at least like to cut the United States off, even if they never launch a real invasion of Australia. It was unclear how much they were really going to do that, or if they were going to do that without help, or if Hitler would actually help them, or what would happen with that. But they want to cut off the United States' access to Australia. And the islands there of Guadalcanal and the rest of New Guinea there to the south was very important because it served as basically like a communication center where we would get a lot of messages from Australia to Guadalcanal and from Australia to that New Guinea area. And so the Japanese really kind of want to block us from getting any messages, flying any planes, getting any supplies, out there. So this is like a real hot spot, basically, where they're trying to move forward, we're trying to block them, and so naturally battle is going to happen. And so what we're going to see happen, interesting enough, is this is going to be a completely aerial battle where we take our aircraft carriers and we're going to be launching planes from them. The Japanese do this as well. And it's going to be totally fought in the air, which is why they call it the Battle of Coral Sea, because it's not on a specific territory. It's just near New Guinea and it's near Australia, but it's really just over the water. And we're going to be shooting down as many other planes as possible. They're going to be shooting down our planes. There's no specific winner per se, because we have so many casualties and we lose so many planes, and so do they. It's why war production is so important, because our planes are just dropping like flies. But at this point, we did stop their attempt at further expansion, at taking over the rest of New Guinea, and perhaps at going into Australia. And we kind of helped our ally out by keeping them safe and really kind of protecting the British. So we consider this somewhat of a victory. They're still in the offensive at this point, but we've been blocking them, and this was hugely important. And it really kind of was a confidence booster for our U.S. Air Force and for our Navy. And you can kind of see there this map yet again that I've been talking so much about. And last battle we're going to really talk about today is a really important one, and it's really the turning point in the Pacific War. The turning point is when everything really kind of changes, and it's further up north here. It's this Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway is really important. The Japanese really want to attack the Battle of Midway and Midway Island. We had a military base there at Midway, considering it was so close to Pearl Harbor, and they want it. We need to protect it. And we need to protect Midway because if the Japanese got it, then they could go to Pearl Harbor next, and then perhaps on to California, or who knows what. And they definitely would continue their offense. We need to stop them in their tracks. And that's exactly what we're going to do with the Battle of Midway. And so it's going to become the turning point in the Pacific Campaign, where we'll stop the Japanese offense and turn it into more of defense. And the real reason that this happens is because of codes, which is why I've included that video about codes. And we're going to watch kind of a lengthy segment today and maybe into tomorrow. But just like in World War I, where codes were very important, because that's how we, figured out the Zimmermann telegram and figured out that, in World War I, Germany and Mexico were talking about teaming up together, and that's what really kind of encouraged us to get into the war. And the same is going to happen here in World War II. So, the Germans have their own code machine called Enigma. The Americans try to kind of create their own code machine. The British do as well. Their version of it is called Type-X. The Japanese have their own codes. We try to break that, especially their code Purple. We're constantly building new machines. We call it the Bomb. We call it Colossus, to try to figure out what their ciphers are and break their codes to try to figure out where they're planning to attack next. And our American intelligence believes that they are going to be attacking Midway Island. The U.S. government disagrees. So we send out some fake messages. The Japanese then reinterpret those messages, which kind of confirms our beliefs that yes, the intended target of their next attack is Midway Island. And so we use this information to our advantage. So we start moving our aircraft carrier so we are ready. So we are going to be able to launch ships at them. We bring in more cruisers, more battleships, and we are basically ready. So as they think they're being sneaky and going to launch this attack on Midway, they can't even get close to us. And starting at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, we just totally annihilate them with just a massive amount of planes. And we are going to have major casualties. We're going to see many planes and carriers of our own destroyed. But as we kind of stop their initial invasion, we're able to take out their carriers and they catch fire and they just explode. And so 4 aircraft carriers are taken out, 250 planes. We do see, people who are fighting to the death here, the Japanese side and the Americans, huge amounts of bravery. And so this is really the turning point, because after this, Japan starts to realize that America is a force to be reckoned with. We are stopping their expansion, and this will no longer be an offensive war, and this is turning now into a defensive war. All right, guys, and that wraps us up for today. If you have any questions or need any help with anything, let me know. You should be finishing that battle worksheet. You can get that information out of the book or off the internet, and then that's due tomorrow. Have a great day, guys. Later.